Today we will be discussing the youth movements in Canada. For more information, continue watching.
The two main factors for Canada's successful youth movements in the 60s and 70s are the population and the economic prosperity. Prosperity in the 20s, a depression and unemployment in the 30s, and then they went to World War II in the 40s. Canada's economy became successful in World War II because they were a wartime command economy. But unlike countries like Britain, Canada was easily able to switch into a demand economy following World War II, which allowed them to continue their prosperity. With the second reason, the population, after the war, the baby boomer generation started, which meant that by the mid-60s, half of Canada's 20 million population was under 25 years old. There was an expanding workforce and an expanding university system. So activism that existed before World War II was mainly mission work, like helping the poor. But after World War II specifically, it became more focused on individual rights and on the actual people who were prosperous themselves. So the universities became increasingly more liberal as half the 20 million population was entering them, and as they had the economic security that generations before them didn't have. The center of the radicalism in the university system was the Simon Fraser University, which was actually the first university to be based in the suburbs. This is important because when you have a university that's based in the suburbs, what you're seeing is a focus on the middle class. And previously, the university systems had only been based on the elite and the upper class. They'd been the only people who could afford to go. Several new universities were created, but attendance in general was booming for all universities. But the Simon Fraser University is going to have a larger population of the middle class and of people who are demanding more rights.
The first issue that was represented throughout youth movements was the emphasis on the nuclear disarmament. So a lot of nuclear testing took place in and around Canada, and in areas with heavy nuclear testing, you could see the impact that the repeated exposure to radiation had on the human body, and it overall raised alarm and fear and thus created a large public outcry against atomic bombing. Another issue that was very important was the liberation of Quebec. A lot of individuals in Quebec wanted to break away and become an independent state, and most opted for a communist or socialist rule under the influence of Fidel Castro and Che Guevara at the time. A lot of the leaders of the liberation movement studied under those communist leaders and wanted a similar government. And women's rights issues were brought to the forefront, especially those concerning work hours, pay, domestic violence, rape, and access to contraceptives, similar to those in the U.S. Workers' rights and unionization of the workforce was also a very important issue. Canada had a booming post-war economy, just as the U.S. and many other countries did. And as the workforce was growing more and more, there was more of a need for unionization and for a more organized system to keep workers' rights in check. Native American and Indigenous rights were also very important at this time. As the country didn't have to focus on fighting a war anymore, it could focus more on both its Native American citizens and its African American citizens, as they did begin to recognize the racial inequality within the justice system and within the government as a whole.
So now we have the Student Union for Peace Action, and it's also known as SUPA. It started in 1965 and consisted of Canadian leftists, and they were the counterculture of Canada. And this organization was very popular. It established nationwide, and it was on various university campuses, and it created this environment where everyone could just come and gather. It was in support of the participatory democracy. It served to stretch over a wide variety of issues, like getting rid of unnecessary violence and war, racism, poverty. People involved in the organization were desperate to create this change within their own country of Canada, but also in the foreign affairs that Canada was involved in. They created the Research, Information, and Publications Project to spread this awareness and essentially demonstrate their SUPA's discontent with the Western society. It wasn't something that they really liked, and they didn't treasure as much as they could have if they did see changes occur. Next, we have the Front de Libération du Québec, or the FLQ. It was led by Georges Shooters, Raymond Villeneuve, and Gabriel Hudon. This was a very violent group. It was associated with over 200 bombings, and it basically was considered Marxist-Leninist terrorist and paramilitary group, and it was a militant part of the Quebec sovereignty movement. It just wanted Quebec to be an independent state, and because of this, it resulted to very violent actions, which included kidnapping of 2 Canadian government officials and also the murder of one of them, which we will learn more about later on.
One key figure in Canadian youth movements is Georges Schroeders, who was a Belgian immigrant. He worked as a spy and a courier in World War II, and after the war was over, immigrated to Canada in 1951. Along the way, he visited Cuba and Algeria and met with other communist and socialist leaders, Fidel Castro and Che Guevara to be exact. He perfected his revolutionary techniques, learning how to make Molotov cocktails, and after he went over to Canada, started the FLQ, along with Raymond Villeneuve and Gabriel Houdin. So he used the revolutionary techniques that he learned from Castro and Guevara to start his own revolution. And the FLQ was known for being very violent. They were associated with multiple bombings, multiple fires, multiple cases of vandalism. And he was arrested in 1963 after a string of bombings and riots. And after his arrest, he eventually repatriated to Belgium, stating that Quebec simply wasn't ready for independence. But he would miss the one thing that mattered to him, his children. Also of note is Rocky Jones, a Canadian civil rights activist. He had connections to Stokely Carmichael and the Black Panther Party, and took on the more radicalized Black Power approach to the civil rights movement rather than Dr. King's established method of peaceful protest. He created Quacha House, which was a club designed to serve as a discussion room on how to combat racism for Black and white activists alike. There was a short documentary made about the Quacha House at the time, which served to provide a platform to these activists and show how widespread the issues of racism were. He founded the Black United Front of Nova Scotia to provide political and economic opportunities to Black citizens. Like in the U.S., Black citizens did typically live in more impoverished conditions, and he hoped to provide better political and economic opportunities so that they were represented in government and didn't live in poverty for the rest of their lives. He worked closely with Dalhousie University to create the Transition Year program while working on his bachelor's degree there. So the Transition Year program was designed for more African American and Indigenous students to enroll and get educations and hopefully remove their families from these impoverished conditions, breaking the cycle of poverty. And after the Royal Commission acknowledged inequality in the justice system, Jones created the Indigenous Black and Mi'kmaq Initiative, once again at Dalhousie University. He hoped that having more Indigenous and Black lawyers and jurors within the justice system would allow for that inequality to be repaired and for the system to be fixed. The October Crisis occurred in October of 1970 and consisted of 2 major events, the kidnapping of James Richard Cross and the murder of Pierre Laporte. So first came the kidnapping of James Richard Cross, who was a British diplomat, and he was held hostage by the FLQ. The FLQ made a list of demands in exchange for his freedom. The freedom of 23 imprisoned felons, $500,000 in ransom money. They wanted fired truck drivers in one specific county of Canada to have their jobs returned, and they wanted an escape route to Cuba or Algeria for the kidnappers themselves. Cuba and Algeria were the specific countries chosen because their founder had been there before and had connections there who could safely house them. And the captors were eventually found, but did manage to negotiate a trip to Cuba in exchange for Cross. 5 days after Cross's kidnapping came the kidnapping of Pierre Laporte, Quebec's Minister of Labor and Immigration. And after the kidnapping, supporters of the FLQ began to rally in Montreal, and they caused quite a ruckus as Canadian protests were known to go violent, similar to the hippie protests in America. And this caused Pierre Trudeau to impose the War Measures Act. This led to the military being led into Montreal. Many protesters were arrested without cause and shortly released after, whereas those who did commit actual crimes were held longer. And Laporte was killed on October 17th, 1970, with very little detail surrounding his death. He is known to be killed by an FLQ member, but nobody knows which one. and his captors were found late December of 1970 and tried in 1971. And the brutality and mystique surrounding the death quickly turned supporters away from the FLQ, as they didn't want to be associated with a movement who killed people for political gain. And this started to signal the beginning of the end of the FLQ, as they quickly lost popularity for their increasingly violent nature in protest.
Another important event of youth reform in Canada was the Sir George Williams University. This was in protest of racism because it was about a certain class, and every West Indian student in that class had been given unreasonably low grades for about 10 months. So at first, one member of them went up and questioned the grade he was getting, and realized that he was getting unfair treatment. And when he talked to the rest of the students in the class quickly put together that it was the West Indian students in particular that were being targeted in this class. But the protest in general was racial discrimination, and really represented a massive unrest in general that the younger population was facing at the time. What happened was the Montreal students occupied a computer room for 13 days. They barricaded themselves in and were able to wave at windows to passersby, which is what brought the media attention, was a massive push for them, because media attention meant that they got their message across. Millions of dollars of equipment was actually damaged during this, the barricade, and 97 people were arrested. So because they were focused on racism, Montreal actually became the center of Black Power, which was the American movement that was happening at the time. It wasn't as big on the American radar because they had other events that were happening in America, but this was Canada's contribution to the Black Power movement. And actually many Black Power activists came up from America to fight in Montreal, and even though the attention shifted off of them later, it was actually an integral part of the racial movement and was Canada's main contribution to the racial movement.
Because of all of this, Canada really ended up with a lot of successes. The inequality within the justice system was acknowledged, and there was a breakthrough in that, and the federal government funded the Black United Front, and it was very helpful in reducing the amount of racism that existed in Canada, and showed that the government was involved and wanted to create a change. And there was a lack of enforcement of the soft drugs that Canada was involved in, so you see there is less of enforcement on things that don't really affect the country as much, and more on those that are affecting the country. And there was a lot of organizations for women's shelters, which helped with just creating more equality and opportunities for everyone. There was a continuation of protests and marches, so people were still very involved, and they did, although there was change, they still wanted to see more happen. There were still a lot of protests that were happening and marches for the feminists, and we saw that there was protection over them because there was a lot of violence being thrown at them. The government saw that this was an issue and something needed to be done to stop it.
The failures of Canada's youth movements were that Quebec was never fully liberated. To this day, they balance French Canada with the rest of Canada. The second failure was that the war on drugs forced the hippie movement underground. So much like America's war on drugs, there was a war on drugs in Canada that specifically targeted the harder drugs. We talked in the successes about how soft drugs were given a more lenient approach, but the war on drugs in general really ended the influence that hippies could have, because that was such an integral part of their platform. So most hippies either joined the mass population, or they went to live in communes where they really weren't effective anymore with social reform. The end of the Vietnam War also decreased involvement in the new leftist movement. Once the Americans were satisfied and involvement stopped in America, the new leftist movement really stopped in Canada as well, because they were not getting international support, and their young people were getting older. 1973 also brought economic uncertainty and rising unemployment, which is why the older generations hadn't been involved in social reform in the first place. The reason the baby boomers were able to protest was because there was a need for them to fill jobs, because they were receiving high-paying jobs, because they could support themselves. So once the economy started to crash in 1973, they no longer had that certainty. And because there was already less of a pull for them to be involved in general, involvement in the movement really decreased. Also, in 1968, Quebec citizens tended to join the Parti Québécois because it more represented them specifically, and Quebec had already been central to the movement. So once they were joining different parties, the new leftist movement really dissipated. It just didn't have the membership to continue on. Another big reason for involvement ending was that they were afraid of retaliation. They had seen the Kent State massacre. They had seen what was happening through the American media, and they were afraid of retaliation there because they had already achieved enough of what they had wanted to that they felt satisfied to quit.